It's an honor to get a chance to speak with you. And actually, I have to say again, because in the late 90s, early 2000s, you and I did many, many interviews when I was working in radio. I actually had longer braids when I was working at in Toronto at 680 News. And in fact, I still remember Don Dwyer was there with us, and we went out for lunch. And I still remember you telling me stories about your brothers, and it was one of the best memories I will ever had because honestly, I couldn't eat. I was laughing so much with the stories that you had about your family. Congratulations on this part of your journey, because if there's anybody who deserves to be in Canada's Walk of Fame, it is you, sir. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, and I do remember you well. And you know, I'm very happy today just to look back on and reflect on my life, and to be honored by Canadians across the country for this honor. It's like, it's one thing to be, to be celebrated as a pro wrestler by your wrestling peers and your wrestling fans. Like, you kind of, you earn that and you get that. But this is on a higher level, or just it's a bit different to be put on level with so many of these great legends that are already on the Walk of Fame. And it's not about wrestling so much. It's about you and about your career and all what you accomplished in that career. And it just means a lot to me, especially when I reflect back on when I first got into wrestling. And I didn't really think wrestling was going to be this story that I could look back on today. Even being world champion, or the WWF, and the sort of the mushroom cloud that it left on the wrestling world, just being this huge. It took wrestling to a whole different level. When I got into wrestling, it was not much different than telling somebody like, hey, I'm a strip dancer, or I'm a topless dancer, and I work in the bad end of town. Or it was kind of a rough living, rough characters, and it wasn't the glamorous life that it would become. And when I got into wrestling, I kind of felt back when I was 20 years old that I had screwed up everything in my life, and this is what I was destined to become a pro wrestler, which was not very much. It was like, I was probably pretty disappointed in myself that I ended up becoming a pro wrestler. And you really, to look back on how I felt then and see how far I've come and how much of a difference I've made in my life and in the fans that watch me, it's a great feeling to know that it was all worth it, and that I made so many inroads in wrestling, and left a great legacy, and I had a great career. I still believe that I told such great stories as a wrestler. I was basically a storyteller. I love to tell a good story. My as a good guy anyway, I was mostly David and Goliath. Telling a story where the little 6-foot Canadian wrestler was going to take on wrestlers that had 100 150 pounds on me, and I still beat them. And it was great that I was given the opportunity to be the champion wrestler that I was by Vince McMahon and WWF back in '92 when I became world champion. But I worked so hard to get to that moment. I worked 6 years in Stampede Wrestling with my dad, and really got this education, or this learning phase that I went through, and learned how to become a terrific wrestler that had great realistic wrestling skills that could tell a great wrestling match. I wasn't famous for my promos. I wasn't famous for my 22-inch pythons. I wasn't famous for being 6'8" or having an incredible physique or anything like that. I was Bret Hart. Oh, he's just a good wrestler. And if you look back on my career, that's what I sold. That's what I did. And that's what I stand out for today, as being a great wrestler. And it's because I understood wrestling. I watched wrestling as a little kid. I watched wrestling since I was 5 years old. And I really studied wrestling, and I really watched it. And I think when I got into wrestling, it was like I kind of understood it before anyone ever explained it to me how it works. It's like, I know how it works. I just know. I know how to do a backbreaker. I could probably show you without anyone ever showing me. Like, this is how you do a backbreaker. and know how it works and to do it perfectly. And it's like that with everything with me. It's like it all goes back to being a little kid and a love of wrestling, and then being at a crossroads when you're 20 years old and going, okay, I messed up and I'm going to be a wrestler, but I'm going to try to be a good wrestler. And I got into wrestling never to be a part-timer or a middle guy, or I got into wrestling to become the greatest, to be, or eventually try to be the greatest wrestler that ever put on a pair of boots. That was my goal from the start. And people go, that's a pretty lofty goal to make for yourself. But I saw myself as being the guy that would save my dad's territory and be the star for my dad as we moved through the 70s and the 80s into the 90s. And everything I did in WWE was stuff that I expected I would have done for my dad. I would become that big star, and he would send me to Japan, and I'd go fly into New York City and wrestle for Vince McMahon's father or somebody like that, or wrestle in Texas or wrestle. But I wanted to be, and I wasn't going to do it overnight, but I was going to try to evolve into being a great wrestler, not a good wrestler, but or just a guy on the card. I never wanted to be any of those things. I wanted to be the star of the show. I wanted to be the greatest wrestler that ever laced up his boots and tell these great stories. And it took me a long way to accomplish all that. But I feel that when I got my chance to be the champion in 1992, and Vince McMahon took a chance on me to be the champion, it was a very perilous time in WWE at that time. They had all those scandals and steroid scandals and ring boys being molested, and there was a lot of bad stuff going on in the company. The company was taking a lot of hits, and the company was kind of sinking fast. And Hulk Hogan and the 22-inch Pythons weren't cutting it anymore because he was guilty of steroids and lying about it on TV, and people caught him lying. And anyway, it's kind of a dark time for the business, and it's probably related to the match I had with Roddy Piper at WrestleMania 8, but especially the match I had with Bulldog in Wembley Stadium in 1992 SummerSlam. People went, geez, like, he's such a good wrestler. And Vince McMahon took a chance on me and made me the champion, made me the star of the show kind of thing, and took wrestling in a different direction, away from the steroids, away from the giants, all the guys that were all jacked up on steroids and stuff became dinosaurs. They got phased out of the business, to be honest. And they went with wrestling, and they made me the sort of the leader of the charge. And I was a good guy to take that chance on. I was a guy that was committed to not screwing up. I wasn't a guy that was going to drop the ball, and you weren't going to find all cocaine in my bag at the airport, or impaired driving. Bret Hart charged with drunk driving, or he couldn't afford any more mistakes from anybody, including himself. And it's like, you know what, we're going to put the title on Bret Hart because he's the safest, most reliable, hardest working guy we got. And I think that's where it all starts. I had my career. From there, I changed I became more devoted to even telling better stories than Wembley and with Roddy Piper and different guys I worked with, to eventually telling some of the greatest stories in wrestling that have ever been told. And I don't think anybody did it better than me. And I'm proud of that. And I also think that my biggest boast about my wrestling career is that I wrestled 23 years, and I never injured one wrestler ever. And if you watch my matches back from any year, from 88 to 89, 92, 97, I was such a physical wrestler. Like the turnbuckles, the body slams, the backbreakers, everything looks so real and so intense, like as intense as a UFC fight. Except for, I'm so proud to say, there's no animals were harmed in the making of that movie. And I was such a good professional that I could do all these things in the ring and walk back to the dressing room and get up and do it again the next day. Wrestling never gets credit for being the performance art that it really is.
And if I can jump in, because that comes from, because people talk about the luchadors, people talk about the wrestling in Japan. Nobody really talks about the wrestling in Calgary with yourself, the Bulldogs, Biff Wellington. Like, there were so many hard-hitting, physical chain wrestling that was going on then. Your brothers, Owen Hart, Brian Pillman, you guys created a hard hitting chain style wrestling that you didn't know where in an instant somebody can lose and somebody could win. That's what I think what made the difference, and I think that influence is still in wrestling today.
Well, like I say, I think wrestling took a huge change of direction from Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior, and it was when I came along. It was like, we're going to go a different direction. No more big guys. We're going to get away from the steroids and the bodies and all that. It's going to be about wrestling until we figure out a new plan. And I steered the company, I think, through a very dark period where they kind of were, they started to grow roots again and kind of start growing again. It was through my experience. And, you're right about Calgary. Calgary was a very special place to go, to learn to wrestle. It was where so many wrestlers got their start, going back to the 50s, and the Gene Kaniskis and the Whipper Watsons and the Lou Theszes and the world champions that wrestled in Calgary. Calgary was a great place to go and a great place to learn. It was kind of where everybody, when you were a rookie, you were a football player playing in the States somewhere, and you said, well, I want to learn how to be a pro wrestler. It's like, we'll send you up to Calgary. Stu Hart will teach you and break you in, and you'll learn how to wrestle up there. And then we'll bring you back to the States and you'll be a big star. And that's kind of what happened through wrestling and then eventually when Canada, like when I started wrestling, Calgary was not, the business had taken its toll. Like, it was not the thriving business that it once was in the 50s and the early 60s. Wrestling was now we still had our fans, but it had fallen off considerably. And wrestling in Calgary was a place where a lot of rookies got started and a lot of old timers finished up their career. So we had old and young mixed together, which actually brought out this great, where the old guys would teach the young guys, and the young guys would learn proper and learn good and learn safe and, learn great stuff in Calgary. And it was also a melting pot in the sense that we had, because of the US dollar being so much stronger than the Canadian in those days, you couldn't get a lot of great Americans. And if you did, the one or two Americans that you could get, you had to kind of be careful because you couldn't afford them. You couldn't afford a lot of them. So you had to rely on Canadian-based wrestlers. And you had to rely on getting a team of wrestlers from Japan and maybe a couple from Germany and a guy from England and a couple of guys from Puerto Rico. And, you had these limited sort of like, okay, so we got a bunch of guys that don't speak English, but they're good wrestlers. And, so I learned, and I came into this environment in Calgary, and my brothers and all the guys that you talk about, like Davey and Pillman and whoever, they all started in Calgary. The guys that did, Jim Neidhart, we learned,
dog.
We all learned honky tonk, we learned how to sell tickets at a time when wrestling wasn't so popular anymore. And we had a strong fan base in Calgary, and wrestlers, we learned good. There was a great education for everybody that worked in Calgary. And I feel that, when I look back and when I walked in the dressing room in WWF in 1984, and I'm starting there, there's Mike Rotundo, there's Barry Windham, there's Brian Blair, there's Jim Brunzell. There's all these great American wrestlers that were great wrestlers, and they truly were very skilled and really good. And, but I was a little different. I was Canadian wrestler. I was a Canadian guy. I did things. I learned German suplexes. I learned British moves. I learned the British uppercut punch, or whatever you want to call it, the lifter, But I had a different style. Like, so when Bret Hart walked out, I was different than Barry Windham. I was different than Mike Rotundo. I was a little bit different than Barry, or Brian Blair, or I wasn't your typical American wrestler. And they were great wrestlers, all those guys that I'm naming. But I just, when you watch me wrestle, even when I was nobody, is I left a different, you'd think about me after I was gone. Like, he was actually pretty good.
Yeah.
It was different. That wasn't the same match that everyone else had. And I think I always had that gift of being a guy that came from Calgary with a different education and a different sort of understanding of how wrestling works, and a belief in, because I tried so hard always working for my father, because it was for my father, to go to WWF. And now I'm trying really hard for a man that I don't know, but he's paying me a lot better than I ever got paid by my dad. So I gave WWF everything I had. I gave them all the best I could deliver every night, every single night, and all that was always paid off for me.
I know we don't have a lot of time, but you were a hero in the ring around the world. We saw mobs of crowds of you around India, in other places around the world. You became, I think, even a bigger hero when you were towards leaving the ring, when you left the WWE for WCW. And we all know about the screw job. We've already heard the stories behind that and what you had to deal with. The kick that basically ended your career, um, from Bill Goldberg, the health issues that you had to deal with. But you always, no matter what happened, whether it be your personal life, to your health and everything else, you always stood tall and you stood strong. What is it about you that no matter what the setback, and it's been many setbacks, you've always somehow you've taken 3 steps back, but you make sure you take that fourth step forward?
Well, I think that's just genetics. My dad was a tough guy and a solid guy and a hardworking guy and a guy that everything was his integrity and his a man of his word, and this guy that was sort of loved and respected for all that. You all that filters down to you someday, where you have. I always tried to be the man that my father was. I always tried to make my dad proud. When people say who was my biggest fan, I go, my dad was my biggest fan for sure. Like, always, right, from Stampede Wrestling to WWF, he was, he would say to me, like, he had a hell of a match tonight, and he would know what he was talking about, and it would make me feel good. And I was working hard for him, and he appreciated that. But everything I did, I tried to emulate my father or what my father would do. And I think life is going to throw anybody. You look at anybody, and they're going to look at their lives and go, okay, I went through divorces, I went through this, or my brother died, or people go through these challenges all the time. And just for me, mine was a little bit more under the spotlight because it was a name wrestler at that time. But you go through these challenges, including having a stroke or having cancer. Or, you take the good with the bad. I mean, I've always been buoyed or made to feel good by my matches, because I always thought, I'm going to be someday I'm going to look back and I'm going to be proud of everything I did in the ring. And that, I've had people say to me, there's no such thing as a bad Bret Hart match, which there probably is a few of them, but not very many. But I mean, I always gave my best every night, whether it was a small crowd, whether it was a big crowd, whether what part of the country I was in, or no matter how tired I was on the airplane. Or no, I came there to perform every night, and I delivered. I always thought if there was one fan out there, he's going to go home tonight and be proud that he watched me, because I'm going to give him 100%. And I always gave 100%. And I think, life has forced me sometimes to be the hero I always pretended to be. And I think when I look back on my biggest challenges, probably is my stroke, and then going through my stroke not long after my brother Owen died, and my career ended from a kick in the head from a guy that didn't have any sense of what he was doing in the ring. To feel like I was just starting to get back on my feet and suffer a stroke, which was not a minor stroke or a mini stroke. It was like a full-on stroke where I lost half the use of my body for close to 6 months, where I was looking at being in a wheelchair for the rest of my life, or maybe not being in a wheelchair for the rest of my life, and just focusing and putting everything you can into getting better and maybe winning that battle. I always thought, I've always been so grateful for the recovery I had, because I was in, I don't know if you saw me after I had my stroke, but I was a train wreck. I mean, I couldn't move. I couldn't walk. I was in a wheelchair for almost 3 to 4 months. After it was just such a challenging time. And when I look back today and I go, geez, I'm walking around. I have a bit of a stiff walk now, where as I get older, it's more pronounced all the time. And it's sometimes embarrassing, when you're say in the cold and walking from from the Safeway, your car, walking to inside the Safeway, and people see you and they go, "Geez, that poor Bret Hart, can barely walk. He's so and it's like, A, it's cold, and I don't move very good in the cold, and but I always go, it's not so bad. Like I'll take it. You can think whatever you want, but I'm just grateful that I'm walking." And all that relates to when I wrestled Vince McMahon at WrestleMania, whatever it was in Phoenix, and like 10 years after the screw job and all that stuff, it was just a way for me to get back my life and quit. It didn't have to be about the screw job all the time, and get back to a even keel and have something else to talk about besides the screw job, which is all I ever heard about. And, I'm glad I did all that. I'm glad I remember when I had my stroke, I thought I'll never walk out to a wrestling crowd ever again. And there I am walking out to the ring in front of, I don't know how many, 20 something thousand people or more than that. I know it was a football stadium, so it had to be more than that. But it was just such a huge victory for me to say, okay, I'm still relevant and I'm doing this. And it wasn't my greatest match by any means, but it was a victory over my stroke. And I look at that and I go, that's the kind of stuff that I was about. I never gave up. It's like, sometimes life you're forced to try to be the hero you always pretend to be on TV. It's like I'm this hero and I'm getting to win titles and I'm beating guys in matches and I'm just want to beat 3 guys in the King of the Ring and I'm great. But it's like, when you have a stroke or when you have prostate cancer or whatever, like the things that I've had thrown at me, including so many loss of family and dear friends in the wrestling business that are not with me today to celebrate. I look at every day as I celebrate my life for them. Like I'm going to live my life to the fullest and in memory of them and try to do all the things that they could have done or wish they could have done. And, I do it with satisfaction. I do it with great pride. I'll always be connected to Mr. Perfect and the British Bulldog and Dynamite Kid and Jim Neidhart. They're always going to be part of they're the ghosts that never leave.
I got to say, thank you so much for this interview. It's been an honor to interview you for so many years. This is a much deserved honor to you. Congratulations on this. And I hope that when you receive this award, no idiot is going to try to jump in from somewhere because Cash Wheeler is not going to be there to smash this guy's face in unless you bring him along, because the beating Cash gave that other guy, it was classic, my friend. Congratulations on this honor.
I'll be safe this time. Trust me.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks very much. Take care.